Side of cementing Saddam's power over Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war had no real positive outcomes for the Iraqi nation. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had died, Kurdish-Arab relations were in absolute shambles, significant damage had been done to Iraq's coastal corridor, and the country was now in debt higher than its GDP. Iraq, though, had the fourth largest standing army in the world following the end of the war, something which in the Arab world was very threatening to its neighbors. Although, then again, standing armies within the Arab world are often very threatening internally. Saddam had thoroughly politicized the officer corps of the Ba'athist military Saddam had thoroughly politicized the Iraqi officer corps to the Ba'athist cause, or at least his interpretation of the Ba'athist cause. With an army so large, though, Saddam was reluctant to shrink the size of his armed forces, fearing that it would cause mass unemployment. And an unemployed mass of trained soldiers would prove a threat to his regime and its stability. An observation which clearly never crossed the minds of American war planners in 2003, I guess. Anyway, Iraq had a large standing army with no goals, which was at least to some extent an internal liability. Another invasion would put the military to use and decrease its liability to the regime. Of all these impediments, the greatest, though, was the massive debt which Iraq had accrued. The country was left. The war left them without at least $86 billion in debt, which would be the equivalent of 278% debt to GDP ratio. The majority of its debt was owned by Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Iraq began to intimidate and threaten these two countries if they would not forgive their debts. This was successful, though, in the case of Saudi Arabia, who retroactively changed the designation of Iraq's debt from loans to gifts and automatically forgave the debt. Kuwait, though, did not do this and continued to insist upon Iraq's full payment of its loans. With the American-Saudi alliance's strategy to put economic pressure on the Soviet Union and its crucial export oil industry by increasing oil production and flooding the oil market at this time would have dire consequences too on the Iraqi economy. As the value of oil decreased with the oil glut, Iraq found it impossible to pay all its debts. Iraq requested that Kuwait, who also surged its production with Saudi Arabia for ideological reasons, its alliance with Saudi Arabia and the United States against the Soviet Union in the expansion of communism globally, Iraq did not like this, so Iraq also requested that Kuwait lower its production to OPEC standards to help the Iraqi oil industry recover and put the country out of such a severe economic condition. Kuwait, though, refused. Iraq, outside of this, had long-standing claims over Kuwait. This predates the Ba'athist regime, going back beyond Iraq's independence into the Ottoman era itself. Iraq had held that Kuwait was a creation of British imperialism, artificially carved out of Iraq in 1913 during the Anglo-Ottoman Convention. And that's, of course, how we got the state of Kuwait, the modern state of Kuwait, if you will. Kuwait's royal family prior to this had been a vassal of the Ottomans to a degree, though. Of course, as everybody knows anything about the Ottoman Empire, defining what the Ottoman Empire was and what its vassals were and where they began and ended is very difficult. To add insult to injury, though, at that time, Kuwait would have just been the city-state, and it wouldn't have been, something like 7,000 square miles of its modern territory. So it's really kind of hard to say who's right and who's wrong over Iraq's claims over Kuwait. And I really think that just kind of goes back to the ambiguity of what the Ottoman Empire was. And, if you want to define the Ottoman Empire under, post-Westphalian standards, that just doesn't work out. Anyway, regardless of all this, Iraq wasn't in a natural incentive to include Kuwait back into its territory anyway, as it would widen its greatest geographic weakness, that being its shallow and narrow corridor to the sea. Of course, the debt and the long-standing territorial claims over Kuwait are ultimately secondary in this invasion and its subsequent annexation when describing the war aims of Iraq. The immediate event leading to the war would be, and which would prove to be Iraq's casus belli, was the slant drilling by Kuwait of their largely Iraqi Ramallah oil field, which was on the border of the two nations. Allegations by Iraq of Kuwait slant drilling its oil fields had gone back all the way into 1960. Now there was a new round of Iraqi allegations of Kuwait slant drilling its oil out of the country that began in 1989 and continued to intensify in the years afterwards, ultimately leading up into the Gulf War. There's this debunked theory that also goes around that April Glaspie, who is then the American ambassador to Iraq, influenced Saddam's ultimate choice to invade the country when he summoned her for a meeting before the invasion. Once she came to his invitation, he began this long, hours-long rant about Iraqi history and how Iraq had been this victim of various factions throughout its history, the British, America, Israel, other Gulf states, Iran, and so on. In particular, Iraq was a victim of this debt entrapment by Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. Gillespie, taken aback by this, responded to Saddam, we, the United States, have no opinion of the Arab conflicts. Which is kind of like this meaningless diplomatic comment intended to ride the fence. But people decided to spin this into Gillespie telling Saddam the United States would not intervene in a war between Iraq and other Gulf powers. And of course, the ultimate war that happened, the war against Kuwait. But clearly, that's taking this episode out of context. That's misunderstanding what was said and how ambiguous what was said was going on and what was going on during Saddam's speech. And anybody that says this clearly didn't read any primary sources and is an idiot. Even in its own context, the Iraqis knew that Gillespie could not determine policy, and she was not a clear representative for what the Bush administration ultimately would think or how it would respond to any Iraqi action. Anyway, let's move forward. On August 2nd, Iraq invaded Kuwait. August 2nd, 1990, that is. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the nation's largely ceremonial military was defeated by the 4th. The Kuwaiti royal family was able to escape the Iraqi armed forces and then establish itself as a government in exile. With the invasion, Iraq declared a Republic of Kuwait on August 2nd, along with the invasion. The Republic existed as a legal entity basically just to justify Iraq's ultimate annexation of Kuwait on August 28th. As soon as Iraq took control of Kuwait, it began looting the country and Kuwaiti resistance against it began. To weaken the resistance, Iraq actually allowed Kuwaitis and foreign workers to leave the country. Wealthy Kuwaitis then left en masse. These Kuwaitis used their influence to sway global opinion against Iraq for the invasion. The United States or the other nations of the Arab world or the intervention that ultimately occurred in Operation Desert Storm never had happened. I think it's kind of clear that Kuwait would have been completely Iraqized with hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of poor Iraqi migrants moving into the much richer Kuwait at behest of the Iraqi government, and they would have replaced and outnumbered the native Kuwaitis, and Kuwait would have just been lost forever. Anyway, by annexing Kuwait in a war of aggression, Iraq had done a post-World War II major no-no. Iraq had changed the lines of international borders. Immediately, a series of UN resolutions condemned Iraq's actions, and countries began to put Iraq under embargo, and Resolution 665 authorized Iraq's naval blockade. These actions ultimately were toothless, though, and would not have persuaded Iraq to abandon Kuwait. As we know, Iraq was not allowed to annex Kuwait, as the United States would form a coalition of 42 nations, including many NATO allies, and large contingents of troops from several Arab countries, which destroyed the Iraqi army and expelled Kuwait from Iraq. The Battle of Desert Storm, right? Anyway, while why should we ask though? Did the United States choose to do this? Iraq had previously been a key ally during the Iran-Iraq War, and the United States used its influence to allow its other allies to take territory. Indonesia was able to annex East Timor, and Israel has been able to annex the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The reason that the United States intervened is ultimately clear and obvious. The war was over oil. In 1980, following the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, President Carter had declared that the Persian Gulf was of vital interest to the United States, and that any impingement of the free flowing of oil in the Persian Gulf would be considered a vital threat to America's interest. The United States would then use any means necessary, including military force, to restore the free flow of oil in there. This was seen during the tanker war, where the Iranian Navy was destroyed during Operation Praying Mantis. Then, for the war was control over oil in the Gulf, including the oil glut that the United States and its allies had engineered in their anti-Soviet geopolitical grand strategy. While Iraq had no intention of invading Saudi Arabia, relations between the two countries deteriorated following the annexation of Kuwait, and fear began to mount within Saudi Arabia that Iraq could invade. Regardless of the unlikeliness of this, Iraq was willing to threaten Saudi Arabia, and it had already invaded Iran, so there was reason on Saudi Arabia to be paranoid of Iraqi invasion. Iraq, after all, was a revisionist power within the Persian Gulf who was willing to use its military power to influence the global oil trade. States who had created and now enforced the Carter Doctrine did so because of the extreme importance to oil to the global economy and thus the global order. The center of the global oil industry is, of course, the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. Any power who has control over this massively important asset to the global economy, if they were able to gain control of it, puts the global order in jeopardy. The United States would not let Iraq be that power, as it saw itself as that power, and the global oil trade as its key to maintaining its global world order and its global, very important in its global grand strategy, if you will. While understanding America's choice to intervene purely from the lens of grand strategy is sufficient, the war clearly also has some ideological dimensions. With the Soviets' ideological surrender to liberalism globally at the end of the Cold War, and the attempts at retrenchment as superpower ultimately leading it to a collapse, the United States was clearly ascendant as a sole superpower in terms of both soft power, hard power, and global ideological legitimacy. It was time to lay down the law, and this would be the war for the global liberal order to do so. George Bush said this openly with his use of the phrase New World Order throughout his speeches. This was the end of great power politics and the geopolitical realism. History as a conflict between peoples and ideas was over. Liberalism had conquered the earth, and international politics would be subjects of the dictates of a global liberal institutions. More authority would come from these institutions like the United Nations, the G7, the Global Monetary Fund, the Global Bank, and the endless prolifera of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And the enforcer of these liberal institutions would be the global policeman, the triumphant champion of liberal ideology, the United States. While the democratization of Eastern Europe was a great boon to this New World Order, it needed a victim to show to all other states that the United States meant business in enforcing its new global order. Not only was Iraq the clear aggressor against Kuwait, a target of which many around the world would not feel bad for, as Iraq was a perfect enemy for the liberal world order. Iraq was an unapologetic nationalist nation ruled by a single one-party state, which was third positionist. Saddam was a grandstander who viewed himself something akin to Hegel's world soul. the great leader who would lead either the Arab people in general, or at least the Iraq people in particular, in the tradition of the great Babylonian Empire into a new golden age. Through his intense personalism, believed both that he was leading the Arab world and he was leading Iraq as a continuation of Mesopotamia. Such a man was everything that the international order of liberalism stood against. President Bush, incensed by the Iraqi annexation, he began building a grand alliance to remove Iraq from Kuwait. His task is worth noting, despite his lack of charisma. In retrospect, his legacy being overshadowed by his son. George H.W. Bush was and probably, I think, the most diplomatically capable president in American history. He would build the largest alliance of military power since the World War and get the approval of the United Nations in doing so. The alliance he built for the war included 42 nations. Many of these allies contributed tens of thousands of troops, and these were not small token contingents. They're simply for the nations to have their officers observe America in combat. The key NATO allies of France and Britain sent large contingents of soldiers in the tens of thousands, with other smaller contingents from NATO allies and other long-standing allies of the United States. The big political breakthrough, I think, is the substantial commitment of Arab states in the region to this war, and other states in the wider Muslim world. Saudi Arabia, Syria, Morocco, and Egypt would all commit over 10,000 troops. With the deterioration of Saudi-Iraqi relations, Iraq's previous threats, and since Iraq had already previously intimidated the Saudis into giving in to their debts, Saudi Arabia was now deeply intimidated and threatened by Iraq. As such, Saudi Arabia would allow this massive military buildup within its own borders, though would prove extremely controversial throughout the Islamic world, as Islam forbids non-Muslims from being on the Arab Peninsula. The housing of non-Muslims troops in the peninsula and America's permanent presence in the region would prove as an impetus for Iraq to attack America on 9/11/2001. Just days after Iraq's initial invasion on August 8th, Operation Desert Shield, or the buildup of American troops in Saudi Arabia, began. Ultimately, around 700,000 American troops would be deployed to the region, and the coalition's total size would near about 1 million soldiers. Iraq's armed forces, for their part, did essentially nothing as this massive force was being assembled, and the United Nations began its heavy diplomatic lifting to formally get Congress and the United Nations to approve of offensive action against Iraq and the invasion of Kuwait. So I think the immediate question is why? Why would the Iraqis let this happen? They could have at least intervened to stop this buildup. Obviously, this buildup was oriented towards them. Iraqi foreign policy and Saddam and his personality were absolutely activist and were not constrained by things like consideration for international law. There are two basic answers, though. Iraq did not want to be viewed as an aggressor, and the second is that Saddam knew intimately the incompetence of his own military forces in comparison to those of the United States. Let's discuss his understanding of his own military's weakness at first. While Iraq was ultimately able to conduct combined armed offensive at the end of the Iran-Iraq war and during the invasion of Kuwait itself, these final offensives were closely coordinated top-down with extreme levels of kind of like puppeteering by the leadership to both the officer corps and the troops involved. Each unit kind of worked robotically to a pre-script, and there was no improvisation at all. The Iraqis were attacking an enemy which they outnumbered, in which they had significantly more armored vehicles, significantly more aircraft, and more artillery than, due, of course, to the international embargo over Iran and the token nature of Kuwait's military forces. Likewise, the Iranians had a highly unprofessional and politicized military, which was similar to the other militaries of the Middle East, in which their officers wouldn't act with agency either. And the Iranians only had light infantry, which even despite its politicalization as the Islamic the Republican Guard, they had very low morale at this time. The United States would have a force of soldiers which was growing quickly in parity of size to the Iraqis, and they had a parity of equipment which, if not outright superior in quality across the board, was manned by men who had much better training and understood much better how to operate this advanced technology in comparison to the Iraqi soldiers. The American military was quite capable and dynamic in combined arms warfare, in which the officers were able to act with agency and take initiative on the battlefield to exploit the weaknesses of their enemy, something that Iraqis just were incapable of doing. The American troops were also green volunteers with very high morale instead of conscripts for the most part, who may even be actively hostile towards Saddam and the Ba'athist leadership. The United States had supplied satellite imaging of Iranian forces throughout most of the war to Iraq, while Saddam and the top Iraqi leaders had been skeptical or believed it was doctored by the United States. They still took to it and used it rather excessively. So when push came to shove, they believed in it, regardless of their complaining about it. And they measured all their preparations in any major offensive beforehand by using this data. Thus, they would know that the United States was able to see their own major troop movements in real time and be able to anticipate any real effort that they had to invade Saudi Arabia and strike first. Iraq's only real military strategy was hopefully then to allure the United States and its allies into some kind of static trench warfare mirroring that of the Iran-Iraq War. He believed that the United States had demonstrated a low tolerance for casualties as seen by the Vietnam War, and that if he could get the United States and its allies into a sustained war of attrition, then he could lead to a negotiated peace. If such a negotiated peace were to happen, then he could just give up Kuwait after taking back, looting the country and ending the slant drilling. Of course, he would take damage and a lot of soldiers lost, but Kuwait would be terrified of slant drilling again in the future. So even if it seemed that Iraq had been defeated, there would still be advantages to this if he was able to maintain power and just give up Kuwait after this war. Of course, that being said, he really didn't put that much trust in this idea of fighting some kind of trench warfare against the United States, and almost all his real hopes were placed in some kind of outside strategy to break up the coalition before the war would even start. And here it must be understood the Iraqi leadership was in a sense trapped by its decision to invade Kuwait. If they caved into American threats and withdrew from Kuwait before battle began, then Saddam would feel like he would have sent a message of weakness both externally to his enemies throughout the Middle East, importantly Israel and Iran, and he would send a message of weakness within the country internally, something which Arab leaders are very afraid of doing due to the endemic coups in the region. After all, the Baathists did gain a power in a coup, lost power in a coup, and then regained power in a coup. This outright strategy would be to lean on pan-Arab identity and Islamic solidarity. Saddam and the regime would attempt to link the war with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Its entire strategy to get out of this impending war with the United States was basically just whataboutism. In this, Saddam found an ally in Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization and thus the de facto leader of Palestine. Despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were guest workers in Kuwait, and when they were expelled and left the country after the war, the whole Palestinian economy was essentially destroyed because it depended hugely upon remittances back to Palestine from Kuwait. I guess Arafat didn't really care about that. Anyway, Saddam and the Iraqi diplomatic corps said that any negotiated peace with Kuwait could only happen if there was peace negotiations going alongside with negotiations for Palestine to attain independence. In this way, they were trying to frame the war not just as an Iraqi war of aggression against its own neighbor Kuwait, but as a pan-Arab struggle against Zionism and the United States. in which Iraq, like Palestine, was the victim. Iraq, in this outside strategy, also began to abandon secularism in favor of Islamism in a faith campaign, a trajectory which would continue all the way until the fall of the Ba'athist regime in the 2003 invasion. The beginning of this shift towards Islamism in Iraq's outside strategy was to appeal to Islamic solidarity and aiding. And one of the most important things they did was add the takbar of Allah Akbar to their flag, which means God is greater or God is greatest in Arabic. Iraq would not just paint the war as a fight of Arabs against Zionists and the West, who supported it, but against Jews, Christians, and unfaithful Muslims broadly, against Iraq being the faithful Muslims. Iraq's attempts to frame the conflict fell on deaf ears, though, as they would also take Western hostages, including the ill-fated British Airways Flight 149, and they showed them on national television, and that really didn't help the Iraqis be viewed as any kind of victims, and that really helped them in the minds of the West and throughout the world be seen as aggressors. Keep in mind, after all the hostage crises in Lebanon and the 1979 American-Iranian hostage crisis, the West generally takes a negative viewpoint towards the Middle Eastern countries taking hostages. So that really did not help Saddam's cause, taking these Western hostages. And Saddam, outside of this whole Palestine thing, sought another outside strategy, and that was in using Scud missiles to attack Israel outright. When the coalition began its air war on January 17th, actual combat between the coalition and Iraq was comparatively small, as the Air Force had no real the Iraqi Air Force, that is, has no real chance to contest the skies against its enemy. The only real way for it to strike its enemies at a distance was to use Scud missiles. Iraq did engage the coalition and Saudi Arabia with these missiles, but its real strategic imperative was still an outright strategy to try and prevent the invasion phase of the war, and they were using missile strikes against Israel. The ultimate goal, if you could say, or some kind of grand strategy on Iraq's part, was that they thought that Israel would retaliate after Iraq attacked it, and so seeing that Israel was at war with an Arab power would then cause Arab powers to be sympathetic to Iran despite them being at war with Iran, and then the war would just kind of end, I guess. Arab leaders in the region would be pressured to stand against Israel and to stand against the United States, and Saudi Arabia, I guess, would tell the American troops to go back home. Of course, we know that didn't happen. We have to remember in the minds of the Iraqi leadership that Israel and Iraq were essentially in an open, low-intensity war since the Israeli destruction of the Tuwatha. It's Tuwaitha. I don't know, is it Tuwatha? Anyway, the Nuclear Research Center in 1981. So they had no real qualms at all about attacking Israel without warning, because from their perspective, Israel had attacked them without warning. That's just the reality, right? Anyway, these Scud missiles were inaccurate when attacking Israel, and they had to be modded in the first place in order to attack Israel outside of their normal range, which made them even more inaccurate. Basically, Iraq was just lobbing these missiles with very small warheads at the entire cities or Israel basically at large, in the hopes that they would end up striking Israeli citizens and killing them out of pure luck. Iraqi leadership had even thought about arming these warheads with chemical weapons to increase their kill count or their power, but they chose not to do so. Firstly, because they had the limited technological expertise to do something like that, and especially because they were modifying an obsolete ballistic missile, which they didn't really manufacture on their own, set to do something that it wasn't designed to do, that was detonate chemical weapons in the air rather than just exploding on contact. And so there wasn't really any reason to retroactively engineer them to explode in the air. So what it would result in is it would just explode on the ground and incinerate the chemical weapon within it, and it wouldn't really do anything. Anyway, If they did that, then even if they didn't work, which was very, very likely that they wouldn't work if they did this, Israel would then be able to retaliate with weapons of mass destruction themselves, and Israel has nukes. So Israel would lose maybe a few hundred people if they actually got the chemical weapons to work, while Iran would lose tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions if Israel used nuclear weapons against him. Surely Iraq might be seen as a victim in this scenario, but it would also be permanently, disabled by the massive infrastructure damage brought about by nuclear weapons, and the Ba'athist leadership would probably be decapitated. So it was kind of a no-go. Now, despite how absurd this outside strategy may seem, in retrospective, it seemed to actually at the time have some kind of chance of working. American soldiers observed both members of the Saudi military and civilians taking satisfaction with these attacks on Israel, and the Bush administration took this strategy and its threat incredibly seriously and did a lot of effort to persuade Israel not to enter the war on the coalition side or to retaliate in any way towards Iraq, and to just kind of take it on the chin. Israel was persuaded by America's own commitment to defend them without their own direct intervention. And in doing so, the United States would deploy Patriot anti-missile batteries and its Air Force to try and stop the Scud missiles once launched by the anti-missile batteries and destroy them on the ground. The Scud missiles were then made to the highest priorities of the coalition to attack and destroy. The leader of the coalition forces in the field, General Schwarzkopf, complained bitterly about this as he saw it as a great waste of resources sending the aircraft after these launchers. The aircraft would basically chase them around and just waste time without destroying them. Anyway, the actual war between the coalition and Iraq is one of the most humiliating curb stops in all of human history. The actual military death toll for the coalition would be 291. That's not counting the Kuwaiti losses in the first phase, I should note, though. While Iraq, ultimately their death toll is unknown, but the number's got to be somewhere in the tens of thousands, usually estimated somewhere between 20 and 50,000 dead soldiers, with thousands of civilians dead as well. So with the coalition, of the official 292 deaths, it's basically split down the middle, though, with 147 of those killed in combat by the Iraqis and 145 being killed ultimately due to friendly fire. And so the coalition almost killed more of its own due to friendly fire than the Iraqis killed. The air campaign began on January 17, 1991, was completely one-sided, with the Iraqi armed forces having no way to fight back. The coalition would lay waste to the Iraqi communication, supplies, and civilian infrastructure and devastate the country and dramatically lower the standard of living in the country, which had once been comparatively prosperous for the region. The Iraqis knew that their own air force could not stand up to the coalition, so they literally hit it to prevent it from being destroyed from the air in the hopes that it could be salvaged after the war. And in doing so, they literally buried airplanes in the desert to hide them. They also tried back-channel communications of sending them to Iran for the Iranians to hold them on their own air bases until the war ended, so that they would not be destroyed by the coalition bombing Iraqi air bases. And in doing so, Iraq paid Iran a substantial amount of money in return. Iran, being the natural enemy of Iraq, then held the planes hostage, and Iraq didn't get most of them back, with them just outright stealing the planes. While Iraq did attack Saudi Arabia during the actual war and the coalition proper prior to the mass invasion of Iraq and Kuwait, it was just a small incursion with no real impact. It was basically just a raid, with Iraqi forces attacking the coastal Saudi town of Kafari on January 29th, and then they withdrew by February the 1st. There was also limited coalition breaches and engagements prior to the main invasion. The general invasion of Iraq and Kuwait, or the ground phase of Operation Desert Storm, began on February 24th, 1991. Arab coalition forces, aided by U.S. Marines, were able to invade Kuwait and liberate, holding down the bulk of Saddam's military, while Western mobile armored units would invade Iraq through the western desert and encircle the bulk of the Iraqi army, which was still located in Kuwait and in Iraq's coastal corridor, defending the city of Basra. As soon as coalition forces made contact with the Iraqi forces, they often surrendered en masse, particularly in Kuwait. The Iraqi government had not prepared for the invasion, though, in the desert, and so the desert was basically essentially undefended as the Iraqis, because of their own weaknesses in supplies, their own inability to do combined arms warfare, thought that conducting high-level invasion through their desert was impossible. Iraq being their own country, they couldn't conduct the same type of operations within their own borders. This then meant that the coalition was able to penetrate deep into Iraq without any real pushback by Iraqi forces. Ultimately, though, the invasion was called off before the Iraqi forces could be encircled by February 28th, when combat operations ended with a ceasefire. During the invasion phase, one of the primary objectives of the coalition was to destroy the Republican Guard forces in detail. These were I guess you could say, basically what could be considered the elite forces of Iraq. Basically, they're not conscripts, they're a professional military. Other than that, there's not that much that's elite about them. I guess they're given better equipment than the general military. Anyway, the reason for this objective was that the Republican Guards were the most heavily equipped units and were the most loyal to the Ba'athist regime. It was believed that these units ceased to exist, Saddam wouldn't have the leverage to defend himself from the populace, and he could be rapidly overthrown. Ultimately, large portions of the Republican Guard were able to escape, though, because the war ended too fast for them to actually be destroyed. Everything happened way faster than the coalition leaders intended, because of just how weak the Iraqis were, and the Iraqis weren't able to really defend their western desert in detail. And so the United States and its coalition allies weren't actually able to, entrap the Iraqi armed forces in Kuwait, because everything just collapsed before that could even happen. Iraqi Republican Guard units and armed units proved loyal and did not surrender en masse, though, as the conscripted military did. Iraqi armored units engaged Western forces, but these engagements would prove to be extremely one-sided and humiliating. Despite the Iraqis having numerous T-72s, which were modified and renamed freaking Lions of Babylon, and the T-72s being near peers to American, British, and French armored units, Western units were able to destroy them en masse. Iraqis did have more obsolete armored vehicles, such as the T-62, the T-69, the Type 69, the Chinese version of the T-62, the T-55, and the Chinese copy of it, the Type 59, along with various armored personnel carriers. But even these weapons, which if they were in Eastern European hands or in Chinese hands, as seen in the Ukraine war, would have been perfectly able to confront and destroy Western units. In the hands of the Iraqis, though, they were worthless. Iraqi armored crews had no substantive training and only had rudimentary understanding of how best to utilize their equipment. They didn't know the operational range of their cannons, while the Western forces knew the operational range of their weapons, and they knew how best to use them. So Western units with longer ranges often would just sit outside of the Iraqi units' effective range and just fire on them. Iraqi units would be unable to understand what was happening and would not try to close the distance so that their weapons would be effective. And they would just sit there and fire inaccurately at Western crews and be taken out one by one. Likewise, even within their distance, the far more capable Western crews were much more accurate and could fire much faster. The Iraqi armored units were just totally worse in every capable way you could imagine, and that Iraqi soldiers who were just terribly trained could basically only use tanks as pillboxes or as some kind of artillery piece. There are reports, possibly anecdotal, of Iraqi tanks in the Gulf War and the 2003 Iraq War firing training rounds because they didn't know which ammunition was which. The General Staff of the Iraqi Armed Forces called a general retreat, as its armed forces, especially its armored units, proved ineffective, and essentially their conscripts didn't just have low morale; they had no morale, and they surrendered on contact. This led to large elements of the Iraqi forces being routed and retreating disorderly on the Kuwaiti, generally just routing themselves out and retreating disorderly on the Kuwaiti Highway 80 towards the major Iraqi city of Basra. This would lead to the infamous Highway of Death episode. Iraqi armed forces had looted numerous civilian vehicles along with military vehicles in which they retreated along the highway. The coalition tried to destroy as much Iraqi equipment and prevent the forces from retreating to the highest possibility they could, and destroyed the retreating caravan. These vehicles were annihilated, and there are photographs of Iraqi soldiers caught in the vehicles, and they were destroyed. And those pictures, let's just say, are very gnarly, and YouTube is not going to accept me putting them up. The grotesque images and the amount of vehicles destroyed created the perception that the United States had committed war crimes as they attacked the retreating Iraqi soldiers. And then you could argue that Iraq was complying with the UN Resolution 660, and Iraqi forces seemed to just defect in mass. Well, they were defecting in mass. So you could argue that this was outside of the action allowed by the Third Geneva Convention, and that they are no longer legitimate targets. This argument, I think, is one-sided in nature, and the grotesque destruction of the caravan influenced Bush and all in the war to end before the objectives could be met. I think that's because with the destruction that was ongoing, there was fear on the coalition side that global sympathy could switch from Kuwait to Iraq, as they saw just how many Iraqi civilians and unarmed retreating members of its military died. So defeating the soldiers in detail wouldn't necessarily, it's just dumb that it would break the Geneva Conventions. But the reality is that America and the coalition at large were destroying the forces in such a comedically one-sided fashion that even if it wasn't a war crime, it was going to be viewed as such, and the Americans didn't want to continue the war lest the war become unpopular because of how much a turkey shoot it became. During this disorderly retreat, Iraq famously lit hundreds of Kuwaiti oil fields on fire as a form of scorched earth warfare in an effort to permanently damage the Kuwaiti economy by ruining its oil fields. At this time, little was understood of how to stop this type of oil fire, and it was just really bad. It was a pretty intense environmental devastation. Anyway, Kuwaitis would be able to get the aid of Halliburton to put out many of these fires, and Halliburton would resort to experimental techniques that they designed, but ultimately the fires would be put out. Iraq's armed forces were in complete disarray at the end of the war and sought to end the war to prevent regime change. A ceasefire was agreed to on February 28th after only about 4 days of ground invasion. On April 11th, a formal armistice was signed and the war officially ended. Despite the war resulting in a total coalition victory and being one of the most lopsided wars in human history, many in the United States, especially neoconservatives, viewed the war as a failure. And this viewpoint of the war as a failure because Saddam didn't lose power ultimately led to them supporting invasion of Iraq in 2003.